October 19, 1944, 0600 hours. Vice Admiral Takijiro Onishi stepped into the briefing room at Mobilikat Airfield in the Philippines, his face carved from stone. The assembled pilots fell silent as he placed a single document on the table. The numbers told a story of annihilation. In the previous 4 months, conventional Japanese air attacks had achieved a devastating 2% success rate. 2%. For every 100 aircraft that attacked American ships, only to manage to inflict meaningful damage. 98 pilots died for nothing. Their bombs missing targets. Their torpedoes intercepted. Their bullets absorbed by American steel that seemed to multiply like a hydra. The mathematics of war had become a simple equation of extinction. But Onishi had different numbers in his briefcase. Numbers that would transform desperation into doctrine, that would turn pilots into missiles, that would make death itself a weapon. He looked at the young faces before him, most barely old enough to shave, and spoke words that would echo through history, in my opinion. The enemy can be stopped only by crashing into their carrier decks with 0 fighters carrying bombs. The room erupted not in horror, but in volunteers. Every hand raised, every voice eager. Because Onishi had shown them the mathematics that made suicide logical, the calculus was brutal in its simplicity. Japan had perhaps 5,000 aircraft remaining. America produced 5,000 aircraft every single month. Japanese pilot training programs had collapsed from 18 months to 3 weeks. American pilots trained for 2 years. Japanese carriers lay at the bottom of the Pacific. American carriers darkened the horizon in numbers that submariner Komatsu had stopped counting. Traditional tactics meant certain defeats stretched over agonizing months. But if every pilot became a guided bomb, if every aircraft guaranteed a hit instead of a 2% chance, the mathematics changed completely. Onishi's calculations contained a terrible beauty. 1 zero cost 50,000 yen. 1 pilot required 3 months of basic training. 1 250-kilogram bomb cost 2,000 yen. Total investment, approximately 52,000 yen and 1 young life. Result, a guaranteed impact on an American ship worth millions of dollars, crewed by hundreds of sailors, carrying dozens of aircraft. The exchange rate suddenly favored Japan. When facing 10-to-1 odds in production, when conventional attacks achieved 2% success, when defeat loomed with mathematical certainty, desperation transformed into cold logic. The Kamikaze mathematics promised to turn Japan's greatest weakness, its shortage of resources, into its ultimate weapon. 1 pilot, 1 plane, 1 bomb, 1 guaranteed hit. The equation was simple. The cost was absolute. The question was whether mathematics alone could change the trajectory of total war. The mathematics began on October 25, 1944. During the Battle of Leyte Gulf, Lieutenant Yukio Saiki led 50 fighters toward the American escort carrier group Taffy 3. These were not ordinary attack runs. These pilots had removed their parachutes, loaded extra fuel they would never need for return, and welded 250-kilogram bombs directly to their aircraft frames. They were human arithmetic, flesh equations hurtling through the morning sky at 300 miles per hour. Every conventional military instinct screamed that this was insanity. Every calculation suggested it was the only rational choice remaining. The first zero dove toward USS Kitcon Bay, aiming for the bridge where the mathematical brain of the ship resided. The pilot's precision was remarkable, his approach angle perfect, his timing exact. Then American 5-inch guns found their range. The Zero exploded 50 feet from impact, close enough that burning aviation fuel splashed across the carrier's deck, but far enough that the bomb detonated harmlessly in the water. The mathematics had promised certainty. Physics delivered chaos. But the Americans had calculated their anti-aircraft fire for conventional bombers that wanted to survive, that would break off under fire, that would attempt evasive maneuvers. Kamikaze pilots eliminated every variable except forward momentum. 2 more Zeros dove at USS Fanshawe Bay. The carrier's gunners poured 20mm and 40mm shells into the approaching aircraft, creating walls of steel through which nothing should penetrate. Both Zeros disintegrated under the withering fire. Mathematical certainties shredded by the overwhelming firepower that American industrial production could afford. The defenders breathed relief. 3 kamikaze attacks. 3 failures. Perhaps the mathematics didn't work after all. Perhaps human desperation could not overcome mechanical reality. Then Lieutenant Saki's Zero appeared through the smoke, trailing fire, riddled with bullets, but still flying. Physics dictated it should have already crashed. Mathematics predicted it should have exploded. But Saki's determination transcended both. He aimed for USS White Plains, the calculation clear in his dying mind. Carrier equals maximum strategic value. Bridge equals central nervous system. Direct hit equals mission success. But American shells tore through his wings, shredded his control surfaces, turned his Zero into a flaming meteorite, barely responsive to his stick. The mathematical trajectory toward White Plains became impossible to maintain. In the 3 seconds remaining of his life, Saki recalculated. He banked hard left, pushing his dying aircraft toward an alternative target that had emerged from the smokescreen. USS St. Lo, a smaller escort carrier, less valuable in the grand strategic calculation, but now directly in his trajectory. Saki dove. The Zero slammed into the flight deck at 0753 hours with the force of a guided missile, because that is precisely what it had become. The bomb penetrated through the wooden deck, through the hangar bay, where fully fueled and armed aircraft sat ready for launch, and detonated in the magazine. The mathematical cascade was instantaneous. Saki's 250-kilogram bomb triggered aircraft bombs. Aircraft bombs triggered fuel tanks. Fuel tanks triggered torpedoes. Torpedoes triggered the ship's ammunition. USS St. Lo transformed from a functioning carrier into an expanding fireball in less than 30 seconds. At 1100 hours, just 3 hours after impact, the carrier capsized and sank. Cost to Japan, 1 Zero, 1 pilot, 1 bomb. Approximately 52,000 yen. Cost to America, 1 escort carrier valued at $6.8 million, 113 sailors dead, 30 aircraft destroyed. The mathematical exchange rate, 130 to 1 in Japan's favor. By the end of October 26th, the kamikaze mathematics had been tested across dozens of attacks. 7 carriers hit, 40 additional ships damaged, 5 vessels sunk. The tactical numbers supported Onishi's theory with devastating clarity. But the mathematical reality contained complexities that simple equations could not capture. Each kamikaze required finding a pilot willing to die, training him enough to hit a target, but not so much that resources were wasted on skills he would never use again, and launching him at the precise moment when American combat air patrols were weakest. The mathematics of suicide required industrial precision applied to human desperation. Japan was about to discover whether enough young men existed to fill the equation. By November 1944, Imperial Japanese Navy Command began calculating the real numbers behind kamikaze operations with cold analytical precision. The statistics emerging from Leyte Gulf demanded systematic examination. Operations research teams, Japan's equivalent to American statistical warfare analysis, compiled data that read like a balance sheet of apocalypse. Conventional air attacks throughout 1944 had required an average of 50 aircraft sorties to achieve 1 significant hit on an American warship. The mathematics were straightforward but devastating. For every major vessel damaged, Japan lost 50 aircraft and, more critically, 50 pilots that could not be replaced. The kamikaze statistics told a radically different story. During the first 4 months of organized suicide attacks from October 1944 to January 1945, American operations research groups tracking Japanese tactics documented 352 kamikaze sorties. Of these, 121 achieved direct hits on American vessels. The success rate, 34.4%. More than 1 in 3 kamikaze attacks struck home. Conventional bombing and torpedo runs, during the same period, achieved just 23 hits from 1,092 sorties. The mathematics screamed a single conclusion. Kamikaze tactics were 17 times more effective than conventional attacks. Japanese naval mathematicians broke the numbers down further, creating what they called efficiency matrices that quantified death with bureaucratic precision. Each kamikaze sortie cost 1 Zero fighter, increasingly constructed from wood and fabric as metal supplies evaporated. Material cost, 35,000 yen. After adjustments for resource scarcity, pilot training had been reduced to absolute minimums, just enough instruction to take off, navigate to a target zone, and maintain controlled flight until the final dive. Training cost 3 weeks of instruction, 4,000 yen in fuel and aircraft, wear. Bomb load, 250 kilograms, 2,000 yen. Total investment per kamikaze, 41,000 yen and 1 human life. American ships existed on an entirely different economic scale. A Fletcher-class destroyer cost $6 million. An Essex-class fleet carrier cost $78 million. Even the smaller escort carriers like USS St. Lo carried $6.8 million price tags. The raw mathematical exchange rate staggered even the most pessimistic Japanese planners. A single successful kamikaze attack delivered between 140 and 1,900 times return on investment, measured purely in material terms. And Japan possessed thousands of aircraft. Tens of thousands of young men had volunteered. The mathematics suggested that if kamikaze operations continued at current effectiveness rates, Japan could theoretically sink the entire American Pacific Fleet for a fraction of the cost of conventional warfare. But mathematics, divorced from reality, becomes fantasy, and Japanese planners were beginning to understand the variables their equations had omitted. The 34% success rate from Leyte Gulf did not remain constant. American anti-aircraft defenses improved with brutal efficiency. By January 1945, success rates had dropped to 28%. By March, 23%. The Americans were learning, adapting, deploying more radar-directed guns, increasing combat air patrol densities, developing new formations specifically designed to intercept suicide attacks. Each kamikaze wave taught the Americans exactly how to defeat the next one. More troubling were the qualitative factors that defied mathematical modeling. Early kamikaze pilots had been experienced aviators, men who volunteered from conviction or honor, who possessed the skill to guide damaged aircraft through walls of anti-aircraft fire to reach their targets. By December 1944, these veterans were gone, dead in the mathematical exchange rate that devoured Japan's best pilots at an accelerating pace. Replacement pilots had 3 weeks of training. Many had never landed an aircraft on a carrier because Japan no longer possessed carriers for training. Some had fewer than 50 hours total flight time. Their success rate, 12%. The mathematics remained superior to conventional attacks, but the gap was narrowing. The equation also failed to account for American production. Japan calculated that at current kamikaze effectiveness, they could sink perhaps 2 to 3 American ships per week. But American shipyards produced 7 ships per week. The mathematical race was rigged. Every kamikaze success was replaced by American steel faster than Japanese pilots could crash into it. Onishi's mathematics had transformed tactical efficiency without changing strategic reality. Japan was winning individual equations while losing the larger calculation. By February 1945, Japanese planners compiled a sobering statistical projection. At current attrition rates, Japan possessed enough aircraft and pilots to sustain kamikaze operations for approximately 7 more months. During those months, optimistic projections suggested they might sink 50 American ships. American production would add 200 ships during the same period. The mathematics of industrial war trumped the mathematics of tactical desperation. But the kamikaze equation had already acquired momentum that transcended rational calculation. Too many pilots had volunteered. Too much propaganda had glorified their sacrifice. Too many commanders had staked their reputations on suicide tactics. The mathematics had become ideology, and ideology doesn't require calculations to sustain itself. It only requires believers willing to die for equations that promised meaning in meaningless death. March 1945 brought the mathematical theory into contact with the ultimate test. Operation Iceberg, the American invasion of Okinawa. Japanese command designated this as the decisive calculation. They assembled every remaining aircraft, scraped together every pilot with minimal qualification, and prepared to solve the equation with unprecedented scale. The operation, codenamed Operation Tengo on the Japanese side, would deploy Kikusui raids, floating chrysanthemums that would descend upon the American fleet in waves of 50 to 300 aircraft at a time. The mathematics were simple. Overwhelm American defenses through sheer numbers, accept losses of 80%, and still achieve enough hits to cripple the invasion. April 6, 1945, 06:30 hours. The first Kikusui wave launched. 355 kamikaze aircraft, the largest single suicide attack in history, formed up over Kyushu and began the one-way flight south toward Okinawa. American radar detected them at 80 miles distance. Combat air patrols scrambled. Picket destroyers positioned at the periphery of the fleet formation opened fire with proximity-fused shells that detonated near aircraft without requiring direct hits. The mathematical efficiency of American technology met the mathematical desperation of Japanese tactics. The collision produced numbers written in fire and blood across the April sky. The first wave encountered a systematic defense that American planners had refined through 5 months of kamikaze combat. Fighter direction officers using the latest radar-vectored Hellcats and Corsairs directly into the incoming formations. The American pilots, with an average of 400 flight hours compared to the kamikazes, 50 hours, executed interception patterns with mechanical precision. They shot down 182 Japanese aircraft before they reached the picket line. The mathematical success rate, 51% destroyed in the first defense layer. The remaining 173 aircraft pressed forward into concentrated anti-aircraft fire from 36 picket. Destroyers specifically positioned to create overlapping fields of fire. The picket ships demonstrated exactly why kamikaze mathematics ultimately favored America, despite Japan's tactical efficiency. Each destroyer mounted 5-inch guns, 40mm quad mounts, and 20mm automatic cannons, all linked to radar fire control systems. They poured 500 rounds per minute per ship into the approaching kamikazes. The mathematics of metal met the mathematics of determination. 79 more Japanese aircraft disintegrated under fire that turned the sky into a solid wall of exploding steel. The kamikaze's success rate had dropped to 26%. But 26% of 355 aircraft still meant 94 potential hits. And 94 hits meant catastrophe. The surviving kamikazes reached the main fleet at 0750 hours. Their targets were mathematically predetermined. Carriers represented maximum value, battleships second, cruisers third. But the mathematics of war rarely follow theoretical hierarchies. Burning, damaged aircraft don't steer with precision. Dying pilots aim for whatever target remains visible through smoke and blood. The kamikazes hit whatever they could reach, and what they reached were primarily the picket destroyers that had absorbed the first defense line. USS Bush took 3 kamikaze hits within 5 minutes. The destroyer's structural calculations never anticipated 3 250-kilogram bombs detonating simultaneously. Physics dictated the outcome. The ship broke in half at 0950 hours. USS Colquhoun absorbed for kamikaze hits. The statistical probability of a single destroyer receiving 4 consecutive suicide attacks was less than 1%, according to pre-war calculations. But kamikaze tactics weren't random. They were mathematical target selection, compressed into seconds. Damaged ships trailing smoke attracted follow-up attacks, like blood in water. The mathematics created feedback loops where success bred more success. Colquhoun sank at 11:45 hours. USS Emmons took 5 hits. USS Hyman 3 hits. By nightfall, April 6th, the first Kikusui wave had sunk 6 ships, damaged 10 more, severely enough to remove them from combat, and killed 466 American sailors. Cost to Japan, 355 aircraft and pilots. The mathematical exchange rate still favored Japan in tactical terms. 355 aircraft worth approximately 14.5 million yen had inflicted damage estimated at $47 million in American ship losses, plus the incalculable strategic cost of removing 16 vessels from combat operations. But the Americans had something Japan didn't: replacement ships. Within 72 hours, 8 new destroyers arrived from Pearl Harbor. The damaged vessels sailed to Ulythia for repairs. American shipyard production schedules didn't pause for casualties. The mathematics of replacement erased the mathematics of attrition. April 12, 1945. Second Kikusui wave. 185 kamikaze aircraft. American defenses had analyzed the first wave, identified weak points in their formations, adjusted fighter patrol patterns, and increased anti-aircraft ammunition loads by 20%. The systematic American response demonstrated an entirely different mathematical philosophy. Every attack was data. Every casualty was a lesson. Every kamikaze tactic was studied, countered, and neutralized through industrial-scale problem-solving. The second wave's success rate dropped to 21%. The third wave, launched April 16th, achieved 17%. The fourth wave, April 22nd, reached only 13% success rate. Japanese command watched the declining statistics with growing desperation. The kamikaze mathematics that had promised strategic transformation was collapsing into a war of attrition that Japan could not win. But they had committed to the equation. 10 Kikusui waves between April and June 1945 expended 1,465 kamikaze aircraft. They sank 26 ships, damaged 225 others, killed 3,389 Americans. The numbers represented the most sustained aerial assault in naval history. A mathematical expression of national desperation that transcended rational calculation. And yet, the American fleet remained larger than when the battle began, because production exceeded destruction. The mathematics had always pointed toward this conclusion. Japan had simply calculated that desperation multiplied by honor could somehow equal victory. The equation was wrong. By May 1945, Imperial Japanese Naval Command faced mathematical reality in its starkest form. The Kamikaze Operations Research Division, a bureaucratic entity that measured suicide with spreadsheets and slide rules, compiled their final comprehensive analysis. The document, classified Most Secret and Designated Analysis Report 447, contained 47 pages of tables, graphs, and statistical projections that quantified the ultimate failure of desperation mathematics. The report's opening summary stated with bureaucratic precision, Tokubetsu Kogakade operations have achieved tactical efficiency 17 times superior to conventional attack methods, while failing to alter strategic trajectory of Pacific War. The numbers told multiple stories simultaneously. From October 1944 through May 1945, Japan had launched approximately 2,800 kamikaze sorties. Of these, 475 had achieved direct hits on American or Allied vessels. A cumulative success rate of just under 17%. The dramatic 34% success rate from Leyte Gulf had been an anomaly. A statistical outlier produced by American unpreparedness and the skill of veteran pilots who no longer existed. As kamikaze operations expanded, success rates regressed toward a mathematical mean that favored American defensive capabilities. The regression curve was perfectly predictable, declining approximately 2 percentage points per month as American countermeasures improved and Japanese pilot quality deteriorated. The damage assessment contained the cruelest mathematics. Those 475 kamikaze hits had sunk 47 ships, according to most careful Allied accounting. Though Japanese intelligence claimed 57 sunk, based on pilot reports that were often wildly optimistic in the seconds before death. Taking the conservative 47 number, the exchange rate came to approximately 60 kamikaze aircraft per ship sunk. Total Japanese investment, approximately 2.5 billion yen in aircraft, bombs, fuel, and training. Total American ship losses, approximately $320 million in vessel replacement costs. The crude ratio of 8 to 1 still favored Japan. But the calculation omitted the one resource that determined everything else: time. American production mathematics dwarfed Japanese calculations entirely. During the 7 months of kamikaze operations from October 1944 through May 1945, American shipyards had completed 94 major combatant vessels, including fleet carriers, light carriers, battleships, cruisers, and destroyers. Japan had sunk 47 ships during the same period. Net American advantage: 47 additional major warships. The mathematics became more lopsided when including escort carriers, destroyer escorts, and auxiliary vessels. American production during the kamikaze period exceeded 340 ships. Japanese submarine and kamikaze operations combined had sunk perhaps 90 vessels. Net advantage: 250 additional American ships. The kamikaze mathematics weren't slowing American advance. They were barely visible against the scale of American industrial output. Personnel mathematics revealed similar futility. The 2,800 kamikaze pilots represented Japan's aviation training capacity, operating at absolute maximum for 7 months. Every aviation school, every training aircraft, every instructor pilot was dedicated to producing kamikaze pilots at the rate of approximately 400 per month. This was the mathematical ceiling of Japanese pilot production. American pilot training programs during the same period graduated 3,200 naval aviators per month, 8 times Japanese output, and those American pilots received 2 years of instruction versus Japan's 3 weeks. The quality differential wasn't mathematically quantifiable, but combat results were. American pilots achieved kill ratios averaging 12-1 throughout 1945, but Analysis Report 447 contained equations that transcended purely military mathematics. Section 4, titled Sociological Impact Assessment, attempted to calculate factors that resisted statistical modeling. The report noted that 87% of kamikaze pilots were volunteers. Though what volunteer meant in a military culture where refusal equaled dishonor remained undefined. Average pilot, age 19 years, educational background, 34% university students, 28% technical school, 38% secondary school only. These were Japan's future engineers, teachers, scientists and leaders transformed into single-use weapons. The long-term sociological cost of destroying an entire generation's educated youth defied numerical calculation. But the report's authors attempted it anyway. Estimated lost economic productivity: incalculable. Estimated impact on post-war reconstruction: severe. Estimated psychological trauma to surviving population: profound. The mathematics also attempted to quantify American psychological impact, the one area where kamikaze tactics had achieved effects beyond pure material exchange rates. American psychological warfare assessments, captured by Japanese intelligence, revealed that kamikaze attacks generated fear disproportionate to their actual effectiveness. Conventional bombing attacks that caused similar casualties were accepted as normal combat. Kamikaze attacks produced requests for relief from combat duty, psychiatric evaluations, and questions about whether Okinawa was worth the cost. The mathematics of terror had achieved modest success. American admirals Nimitz and Spruance, normally unflappable commanders, had expressed unusual frustration with kamikaze operations, even contemplating replacing army generals they felt weren't advancing fast enough on Okinawa to end the Navy's exposure to suicide attacks. But psychological effects didn't sink ships or win wars. The mathematics always returned to production capacity. Analysis Report for 47's final section, titled Projected Operational Sustainability, calculated that Japan possessed enough aviation fuel, airframe materials, and potential pilots to continue kamikaze operations at current intensity for approximately 4 more months through September 1945. After that point, mathematics dictated complete collapse. Fuel stocks would be exhausted. Aluminum supplies were already gone, replaced by wood and fabric aircraft that barely flew. The pipeline of young men, willing and able to to become kamikaze pilots would deplete through mathematical inevitability. Japan was producing approximately 1,200 military-age males per month from its conscription system. Kamikaze operations required 400 of them. Other military branches, factory work, and agricultural production needed the rest. The mathematics of population couldn't sustain the mathematics of suicide. The report's conclusion section avoided the emotional language that characterized Japanese military communications. Instead, it presented pure mathematics, stripped of ideology. Current kamikaze operational tempo produces American ship losses at 6.7 vessels per month. American ship production produces 48.5 vessels per month. Net American naval strength increase, 41.8 vessels monthly. Conclusion: kamikaze operations cannot achieve strategic objective of American fleet attrition. Regardless of tactical success rates, kamikaze operations represent optimized tactics applied to strategically unwinnable scenario. Mathematics dictate defeat timeline shortening marginally, but outcome remaining unchanged. Vice Admiral Takijiro Onishi received analysis. Report 447 on May 23, 1945. He read it completely, all 47 pages of tables and graphs that proved mathematically what he had known intuitively since October 1944. The kamikaze mathematics worked only if you ignored American production, only if you calculated exchange rates in isolation, only if you forgot that desperation cannot overcome industrial capacity, no matter how efficiently you quantify it. But Onishi had never believed mathematics would win the war. He had believed that Japanese spirit, properly harnessed and aimed, might convince Americans that victory wasn't worth its cost. The mathematics were simply the rationalization required to convince superiors and pilots that suicide made sense. The real equation was psychological: Japanese willingness to die versus American willingness to accept casualties. That equation was also failing. Americans absorbed 3,389 dead from kamikaze attacks at Okinawa without wavering. They scheduled Operation Downfall, the invasion of Japan, for November 1945, fully expecting 250,000 casualties and accepting that cost as necessary. The American mathematical calculation was brutally simple. Casualties are temporary. Defeat is permanent. Therefore, accept casualties. Japan's calculation had been equally simple. Defeat is inevitable. Casualties might inspire fear. Therefore, maximize casualties through suicide. But one nation possessed the industrial capacity to sustain its mathematics. The other possessed only desperation, dressed as calculation. Onishi filed Analysis Report 447, without forwarding it to Naval General Staff. The mathematics didn't matter anymore. Kamikaze operations would continue, not because they made sense, but because Japan had exhausted all alternatives except surrender. And surrender wasn't yet mathematically acceptable to military leadership, who had spent 4 years calculating that death with honor exceeded life with defeat. The kamikaze mathematics had become a circular equation that fed on itself. Desperation justified suicide tactics. Suicide tactics intensified desperation. Intensified desperation justified more suicide tactics. The mathematics solved nothing but provided the illusion that Japan retained agency, that calculations still mattered, that numbers could somehow change the trajectory of industrial apocalypse. They couldn't, they never could. But the equation required solving anyway. Written in the bodies of 19-year-olds who volunteered for mathematics they didn't understand toward objectives that calculations had already proven impossible. June 1945 brought the mathematical endgame. Operation Kikusui 10, the 10th and final organized kamikaze wave at Okinawa, launched on June 21st to 22nd. By this point, the mathematics had degraded beyond recognition. Japan scraped together 110 aircraft for what intelligence estimated would require 400 to achieve meaningful impact. The pilots averaged 43 flight hours. Some had never flown their assigned aircraft type before the suicide mission. Training had compressed from 3 weeks to 10 days. Several pilots couldn't identify American ship classes and were instructed simply to crash into the largest vessel visible. The kamikaze mathematics had devolved into desperation so pure it no longer pretended to be strategy. The 10th Kikusui wave achieved 9 hits, an 8% success rate. American defenders shot down 94 aircraft before they reached the picket line. 7 more crashed due to mechanical failure or pilot error. The remaining 9 kamikazes scored hits on 5 destroyers and 4 support vessels. None sunk, all repaired within weeks. The mathematical exchange rate had finally crossed the threshold where kamikaze tactics became less effective than conventional attacks. The equation that Onishi had constructed in October 1944, promising 17 times improvement over traditional bombing, had collapsed to parity, then inferiority. Physics and production had defeated desperation, but the mathematics continued because stopping required admitting mathematical failure, and military institutions resist quantifiable defeat more stubbornly than physical defeat. Kamikaze operations expanded beyond naval targets to include modified proposals for ground combat. Planners developed calculations for Operation Ketsugo, the defense of Japan itself, that projected using 10,000 kamikaze aircraft plus 5,000 kamikaze boats plus unknown numbers of ground troops equipped as human mines. The mathematics had metastasized from tactical desperation into strategic fantasy. Japanese planners calculated that if every plane, every boat, every soldier became a guided weapon, they might inflict 500,000 American casualties during the invasion. And if American casualties reached 500,000, the mathematical theory suggested, American political will might collapse, forcing negotiated peace instead of unconditional surrender. The calculation contained one fatal assumption, that American leadership would calculate casualties the same way Japanese leadership did, that numbers alone would determine strategy, that mathematics divorced from industrial capacity and political will could dictate outcomes. But American calculations operated on entirely different equations. President Truman's mathematics were simple. Total war casualties to date, approximately 110,000 American dead. Projected casualties from invading Japan, up to 500,000 additional dead. Total, 610,000 casualties to achieve unconditional surrender and permanent peace. Acceptable, the American mathematical framework calculated in absolutes. Complete victory or unacceptable failure. There was no equation for negotiated settlement, no calculation that made partial success acceptable. The mathematics were binary. Then new variables entered the equation. July 16, 1945, 05 to 9 hours. Alamogordo, New Mexico. The Trinity test proved that American scientific capacity could match Japanese desperation with quantifiable apocalypse. The mathematics of nuclear fission produced 20 kilotons of explosive force, roughly equivalent to 40 million pounds of conventional explosives, delivered by a single bomber carrying a single bomb. The kamikaze mathematics that calculated efficiency through suicide suddenly confronted calculations that rendered individual desperation irrelevant. 1 B-29, 1 atomic bomb, 1 city deleted. The exchange rate became incomprehensible. Kamikaze operations required hundreds of pilots dying to sink one ship. Nuclear operations required one crew surviving to eliminate one city. August 6, 1945, 0815 hours, Hiroshima. The mathematical theory became reality. The bomb designated Little Boy detonated 1,900 feet above the city, with a force that killed 70,000 humans instantly, and another 70,000 through radiation over subsequent months. Cost to America: one atomic bomb, approximately $20 million in research and production. 1 B-29 aircraft and 11-man crew, all returned safely. Total investment, $20 million, 0 casualties. Cost to Japan: one city, 140,000 dead, uncalculable strategic impact. The exchange rate, infinite. The kamikaze mathematics that Vice Admiral Onishi had constructed through careful calculation of costs versus benefits had been rendered obsolete by mathematics operating on entirely different scales. August 9, 1945, Nagasaki. A second atomic bomb, Fat Man, detonated, with similar results. 40,000 immediate deaths. 40,000 subsequent deaths. One city rendered not functional. The mathematics had spoken with thermonuclear clarity. Japan could continue kamikaze operations, could send every remaining pilot into suicide dives, could transform every citizen into a human weapon, and the exchange rate would never approach parity with American industrial and scientific capacity. The kamikaze equation that promised to balance resource scarcity through desperation had encountered calculations that eliminated the very concept of balance. America possessed weapons where one bomber equaled more destructive power than all kamikaze attacks combined. August 15, 1945. Emperor Hirohito announced surrender in a radio address that avoided the actual word surrender but made the mathematical reality explicit. The enemy has begun to employ a new and most cruel bomb, the power of which to do damage is indeed incalculable. Incalculable, the word acknowledged that Japanese mathematics had reached their limit, that no equation could solve weapons that operated beyond conventional calculations. The kamikaze mathematics that had promised tactical efficiency could not counter strategic impossibility. The war ended not because kamikaze operations had failed mathematically. They had actually achieved modest success in their limited objectives, but because American capabilities had transcended the scale on which kamikaze mathematics operated. Vice Admiral Takijiro Onishi confronted his own mathematics on August 16, 1945. The man who had transformed desperation into calculation, who had quantified death as tactical efficiency, who had convinced 2,800 young men that their suicide made mathematical sense, now faced his own equation. He committed seppuku, ritual suicide, but rejected assistance for the final merciful cut. He took 7 hours to die, deliberately extending his suffering as mathematical payment for the suffering his calculations had caused. His suicide note contained no numbers, no statistics, no equations. Only this: I wish to express my deep appreciation to the souls of the brave special attackers. They fought and died valiantly, with faith in our ultimate victory. In death, I wish to atone for my responsibility. The kamikaze mathematics left final accounting: 3,912. Pilots dead in organized suicide attacks. 47 to 57 Allied ships sunk, depending on whose records you believed. 368 ships damaged. 4,900 Allied sailors killed. The exchange rates, the success percentages, the cost-benefit analyses, all the mathematics that had transformed young men into guided missiles ultimately calculated to one inescapable conclusion: desperation cannot be quantified into victory. Efficiency cannot replace capacity. Tactical success cannot overcome strategic failure. The mathematics were correct in isolation, but meaningless in context. Japan had optimized the wrong equation. Calculated answers to questions that didn't determine outcomes. Transformed death into data without changing the fundamental calculation that industrial capacity multiplied by time equals victory. The kamikaze mathematics were perfect, and perfectly irrelevant. The kamikaze mathematics survive in military academies worldwide, not as a success story, but as a cautionary equation. They represent what happens when tactical innovation confronts strategic impossibility, when desperation masquerades as calculation, when the mathematics are technically correct but fundamentally wrong. Modern military analysts study the kamikaze operations research data as a case study in misallocated optimization. Japan had successfully identified and exploited the most efficient method to damage American ships using limited resources, achieving 17 times improvement over conventional tactics, while completely failing to recognize that efficiency was irrelevant when the opponent could absorb losses faster than you could inflict them. The mathematical legacy extends beyond military history into darker territories of political calculation. Terrorist organizations throughout the modern era have studied kamikaze mathematics, recognizing the exchange rate logic, minimal investment in training and equipment, maximum psychological impact, quantifiable tactical success, measured in casualties and destruction. The suicide bomber, the truck bomb, the hijacked aircraft, all follow mathematical frameworks, similar to what Vice Admiral Onishi developed in October 1944. They optimize desperation, calculate maximum impact per death, and measure success through enemy casualties, rather than strategic objectives achieved. And like kamikaze mathematics, they confuse tactical efficiency with strategic victory, mistaking the ability to inflict damage for the capacity to change outcomes. But the kamikaze mathematics also pose profound questions about human calculation itself. Those 2,800 pilots weren't mindless drones. Most were educated volunteers who understood mathematics, who calculated their own exchange rates, who concluded that one life traded for one ship made rational sense within the framework they inhabited. They solved the equations correctly, using the variables they were given. Their mathematics weren't wrong. Their axioms were. They calculated within a system that defined honor as superior to survival, national destiny as more valuable than individual existence, and death with purpose as preferable to life with defeat. Given those axioms, the kamikaze mathematics were perfectly logical. Which raises the uncomfortable question: how many modern calculations, in warfare, politics, economics, and ideology, are similarly perfect solutions to fundamentally flawed equations? The final mathematics emerged decades after surrender. Japanese economists calculated the long-term cost of kamikaze operations not in yen or ships, but in lost human capital. Those 2,800 pilots represented a statistical sample of Japan's educated youth, 34% university level, concentrated in engineering, science, and technical fields. Demographic models suggest they would have produced, over average lifetimes, approximately 85,000 patents, 12,000 scientific papers, 340,000 skilled workers trained, and $8.7 billion in economic activity measured in 1940s dollars. The kamikaze mathematics that calculated 41,000 yen investment per pilot omitted the largest cost entirely: the future that each pilot represented. Japan traded decades of compounding human capital for months of tactical efficiency. The exchange rate, calculated across lifetimes instead of combat sorties, became not 130 to 1 in Japan's favor, but approximately 200,000 to 1 against. This is the mathematical legacy Vice Admiral Onishi left, a perfect demonstration that numbers without context become weapons against those who wield them. That efficiency measured in isolation produces optimal paths toward wrong destinations. That desperation quantified is still desperation, no matter how precisely calculated. The kamikaze mathematics achieved everything they promised: 17 times improvement, 34% success rates, positive exchange ratios, maximum tactical efficiency from minimal resources, and they changed nothing. The war ended when American mathematics, operating on scales of industrial production and nuclear physics, rendered Japanese calculations irrelevant. Not wrong, not inaccurate. Simply operating on equations too small to matter. The 2,800 pilots died solving mathematics perfectly, while the world moved to calculations beyond their equations. Their sacrifice was real. Their courage was unquestionable. Their mathematics were correct. And their deaths were unnecessary. Products of calculations that confused optimization with strategy, efficiency with effectiveness, tactical success with strategic victory. The kamikaze mathematics remain the most precisely documented case study in human history of desperation dressed as logic, of suicide rationalized through spreadsheets, of young men transformed into data points in equations that promised meaning through quantified death. The mathematics were perfect. The calculation was tragedy, and the final number, the only one that ultimately mattered, was 0, the strategic impact of optimal tactics applied to unwinnable wars.